Dr. Vitor Izecksohn is a professor in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He's been teaching in one place or another since 1986. But he looks so young. He looks like he's 40 years old, but he's actually 43. But anyway, he's taught a lot, taught in Minas Gerais first, and then has been teaching in Rio for the last couple of decades. He has received a number of awards and fellowships, Fulbright fellows at the Gilder Lehrman Institute in New York, as well as at Yale University, John Carter Brown Fellowship, Max Planck Fellowship. The list goes on and on. Right now, he is a research fellow at the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. That's in near Mount Vernon. I think your current address actually says Mount Vernon on it, right? Yeah. So he's living on Mount Vernon. So that's worth a lot right there. He has published in Brazil, but also here in the United States, a number of chapters and articles and a number of books, including Slavery and War in the Americas, Race, Citizenship, and State Building in the United States and Brazil with the University of Virginia Press. In Brazil, A History of the Brazilian Liberal Political Thought in the 20th Century, the Chorus of Disagreement, the Paraguayan War, and the Professional Nucleus of the Brazilian Corps of Officers, and a number of other things. We could go on and on. But Vitor, why don't you come up here, and first of all, let's get to know our audience. So how many of you speak Spanish or Portuguese? Raise your hand. How many of you speak Portuguese? Okay, and how many of you learned your Portuguese in Brazil? So where in Brazil? Let's just hear. Rio. All right.
Paraíba.
Fortaleza.
Fortaleza.
Espírito Santo.
São Paulo.
Okay. So you kind of have all the teams, all the soccer teams covered. Well, maybe a little bit. So anyway, let's join me in welcoming Dr. Vitor Izecksohn.
Thank you. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be at Brigham Young University to talk to you today, Brigham Young, and I would like to thank Professor Jeffrey Shumway and all those involved at the Rockefeller Center for this invitation, as well as I am grateful to the Fred W. Smith Library for bringing me here from Brazil, which is a long trip, as you know. And as many of you have lived in Brazil, in big cities, you know that many of the street names, especially in central areas of those cities, refers to battles or events of the Paraguayan War, which means that at least at the time those streets were renamed, it was a very important civic point of reference for Brazilian society, which is no longer the case, as the war now is, how long has it? It ended in 1870, so it has been around 150 years of its end, and nobody talks about this much anymore. The experience of warfare in Brazil has been very rare since the end of the Second World War. We sent a brigade to fight in Italy, among with Americans. So it has been vanishing from public imagination for a long time. Anyway, I think the story of Brazilian society during the war is important enough to be emphasized. And I think that by doing that, we can make some parallels with the US history and the Civil War era, as the Paraguayan War is part of a set of wars, national wars, fought during the 1860s, such as the American Civil War, the Mexican War of the Reform, and unification wars in Germany and Italy, to talk just about some of the 1860s conflicts around the globe. Oops.
Sometimes it takes a little bit. There's a little
So the decade of 1860 was a period of great warfare around the Western Hemisphere, in Mexico, in the US, in Rio de la Plata. And Brazil and the US had strong diplomatic and economic links. The US was the third country to recognize Brazilian independence after the United Provinces of Rio da Plata, which is a country that no longer exists. It's the actual Argentina, and the Kingdom of Dahomey in Africa. And of course, Brazil and United States were linked because the US was the largest buying country of our coffee. So coffee integrated Brazil and the United States along the 19th century, although there were no steamship lines bringing passengers from New York to Rio. So if someone want to go from New York to Rio, this person would have to go to London and then to take a steamship to Brazil. The first line connecting the two cities and the two countries was created only in 1868. And of course, Brazil bought a lot of wheat from the US, as we were never big producers of wheat. So there was this commerce, but the commercial balance was in favor of Brazil because coffee was not taxed in the US at that time. So in 1824, the U.S. was the third country to, if we consider Dahomey, to recognize Brazilian independence. It was part of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was settled on 1823. In 1824, the U.S. recognized Brazilian independence. Now, during the American Civil War, Brazil remained neutral, like England and France, which was not good for diplomatic relations. That means that the Brazilian government recognized a state of belligerence between the North and the South. And of course, Union politicians didn't like it because basically it meant that Brazil had big sympathies for the Confederate cause, which had some sense as Confederates and Brazilian elites led societies which had slaves. And the defeat of the Confederacy would have strong effects on the Brazilian economy. Of course, Brazilian neutrality never went to the point of breaking in the relations between the Brazil and the Union, the United States, but sometimes relations were really strained. Confederate vessels, the so-called blockade runners, they could dock at the Brazilian harbors, and this also created a lot of strain because sometimes we had naval battles in the coast between Union boats and and Confederate boats, and especially Secretary of State William Seward, American Secretary of State, was really not much happy with this circumstance. Well, with the end of the American Civil War and, of course, the end of slavery, U.S. emancipation had a big impact in Brazil. The South of the United States was the largest slave society in the Americas, in the world. And without this partner, it became clear to Brazilian imperial elites that slavery would not live long, that would be a demise. So It was really clear, and it made Brazilian authorities reflect and try to find ways to deal with the inevitable demise of slavery, which, of course, was going on. It was a thought that had been going on in Brazil since the end of the international slave traffic in 1850. Well, the South, the American South, was the largest slave-populated region in the Americas, but Brazil was the largest import region of Americas. Brazil imported around 4 million slaves between 1620 and 1850, while the south of the U.S. South imported maybe 500,000 from 1680 to 1808. The end of the American Civil War also brought Confederate immigration to Brazil, especially farmers from Alabama, Georgia, and northern Texas migrated to Brazil because they felt they could not live in the American South during the Reconstruction period when civil rights legislation such as the 14th and the 15th amendments were passed. So there was southern immigration to many parts of the Americas, to Mexico, to Venezuela, but the main wave went to Brazil. Around 20,000 people went to Brazil, which is a rare phenomenon because normally you don't see US people migrating abroad. You see people migrating from abroad to the US. And from these 20,000 people, many returned, so probably no more than 3,000 made alive in Brazil. And they were responsible for introducing some changes in Brazilian agriculture, like the big plow, like the watermelon, which was not common in Brazil before, some varieties of corn, which were related to the habits and the agricultural culture they were bringing. And these persons came to Brazil basically aiming at live on a society where slavery was still legal, but the time when they arrived in Brazil, there were few slaves available to be bought. So those who stayed, finally, they mixed it around in 3 generations with Brazilians and became planters of corn, coffee, but not of cotton. So this was one of the effects. And probably they expected a lot of government help. But by the time when they arrived in Brazil, the war against Paraguay was going on. So there was scarcity of money to help. Oh, they founded this town, Vila Americana, in the state of São Paulo, in the west of the state of São Paulo. It's still there to these days. It's a bigger city, of course, now, and they have lots of family names still connected to the US, like the Jones, which is a popular name of a Brazilian rock star, Rita Lee Jones. So some people stayed, and during the forthcoming years, they were shifting from farming to liberal professions like doctors, dentists, lawyers, and other activities. Well, I will introduce now the Paraguayan War. As many of you already know, state building process in the Rio de la Plata region was really slow. It means basically the strengthening of central powers towards through a fight between the littoral versus the interior provinces, liberal versus conservative forces, and the development of national armies in substitution of local and provincial militias. This is a map of South America around 1867. As many maps, it reflects the interests of the countries who paid for. So this is a Paraguayan map, and it shows an enormous Paraguay crossing the two margins of the Paraguayan River, including the Bolivian Chaco and the Argentinian Chaco. And this is the area of Argentina which was basically included in the national state. Patagonia was still out, and Bolivia here still has its littoral. So, and Brazil still has not, the state did not incorporate by this time the state of Acre from Bolivia. So this is South America, and the Paraguayan War was fought around this region here. This is a current map of Paraguay, but not of Brazil. So, well, this is the battle zone. No? The battle zone went up, from the province of Mato Grosso in Brazil to Rio Grande do Sul to Paraguay. It was a long war. It started in December of 1864 and ended in March 1870, so 4 years and 7 months. The Civil War was, 4 years? April 61, April 65. Some people will say it's still being fought these days, but I don't agree. Let me try to explain the situation. The causes of a war are always difficult. You always have different versions. But basically, the war was linked to Uruguay. Uruguay had been an independent nation since 1828. But many Brazilian farmers lived in Uruguay, and they used to bring their cattle and slaves without respecting border rights. And Brazilian authorities believed that this, this situation, this leniency, was a condition for the existence of an Uruguayan nation. But from 1861, a new government in Uruguay started taxing the cattle and the slaves going through the frontier. Uruguay was free soil, by the way. No? It had abolished its slavery in 1842. So Brazilian farmers started complaining to the government that they were not being well treated. The central government did not intend to intervene in Uruguay because, it would be an international problem. But especially elites coming from Rio Grande do Sul, which is Brazilian southern province, were very influential, and they pressed the central government. And then Brazilian intervened in Uruguay, which means sent troops and navy, overthrew the government and backed a new government which would be favorable to Brazilian interests in the region. Well, the government of Paraguay felt threatened by this because they thought, because President Lopez, who ruled Paraguay as a dictator, thought that if Brazil could intervene in Uruguay, it could later intervene in Paraguay. So the Paraguayans launched the invasion to this region in the province of Mato Grosso, and they tried to get to Uruguay to help their allies there. And then the war began. So people keep discussing who should be blamed, Of course, the Paraguayans and many people in the northern province of Argentina, they blame Brazil. And the nationalist historiography of Brazil blamed the Paraguayans because we were attacked without a declaration of war, like a big Pearl Harbor. So the declaration came after the invasion. Anyway, it started as what seemed to be a very localized conflict, a short conflict, but as many wars, like the Civil War in the United States, they started as something small, but then they kept waging for years. Well, strategically, what Paraguay wanted from the war? The Paraguayan government believed that by coming to this northern Argentinian province, it would be supported by Federalist forces. Federalists were those Argentinians that did not abide by the idea of a centralist state based in Buenos Aires. And Lopes believed he would be supported by them, and that he would be able to get to Uruguay and create a new balance of power in the region, involving the Paraguayans, the Federalists, and the Blancos in Uruguay, who also supported Paraguay. And Brazil expected that by defeating Paraguayan forces, it would be able to quickly overthrow Lopes and then end the war. So the most famous proclamation about the war was made by Argentinian President Bartolomeu Mitre, who said, 3 days to the 3 days to the streets, 3 weeks to the barracks, 3 months to Asunción. But it never happened that way. So the war would be waged for a long period. Lopes is a very curious guy. He had a lot of power. He was basically the state in Paraguay. And Paraguay had only 3 rulers since its independence in 1811. The first was Dr. Francia, who ruled Paraguay since 1811 to 1840, when he died. Then Lopes' father, who was Carlos Antonio Lopes, who ruled Paraguay for 12 years. Basically, people ruled until they died like kings. Well, of course, they were not kings. The rhetoric was republican. But we have large, big governments and dictatorial governments, but also governments involved in a process of unifying the region. So maybe Paraguay, with its small population, its backward economy, was a much more unified nation by that time than Argentina or Uruguay, but had no resources. And Lopes used to take decisions without considering advising. So he believed he would find support in northern Argentina. And, in a war, things never happen as they are rehearsed. So he didn't found it. And he had, as things went on, he had to fight the war alone. And of course, Paraguay had, 500,000 inhabitants. Brazil had maybe 9.5 million. And Argentina had maybe at this time 1.5 million or 2 million. So it was a totally imbalanced war that Paraguay could not win. So there is a gamble in the beginning of the war. Sometimes gambles, they work. You gamble and you invade and you find ways to get to terms with your foes. But if it doesn't happen, as was the case here, then there is nothing that can be done. Either you surrender or you fight until the end. So the Paraguayan leader decided to fight until the end. The famous saying, morro con mi patria. I will die with my fatherland. That's beautiful, but it's not the case that everybody wants to die with the leader. So this kind of rhetoric is always very painful. Anyway, it was a very costly war. After 1866, it became a war of invasion of Paraguay. And of course, the so-called allies, they framed a treatise, which was the treatise of the Triple Alliance, because it was a Triple Alliance, Brazil, Argentina, and the new government in Uruguay. And the treatise the treaty was secret, but it stipulated that all the borders under conflict would be settled in favor of the Triple Alliance countries. And it also stated that the Paraguayan army would be dissolved after the war. So when news of the treaty finally spread around 1866 through a discretion of the British ambassador in Argentina, it became really clear that it was conditions post-war would be really harsh on Paraguay. So I think the knowledge of this treaty also helped Paraguayans to fight until the bitter end, because they thought that their country would disappear if they lost the war. Well, in Brazil, which is my country of study, the war was very popular in the beginning because it was basically a reaction to an international attack. And as you know, when a country is attacked, initially there is a lot of patriotism coming on. It was the case of US in 1941. It will be probably the case with Ukraine today or tomorrow. And in Brazil it was not different. So a lot of people mobilized for war, normally young people who thought they would fight for 3 months and they would come home and no major harm would happen to them. So the press showed all those parties and gatherings and civic ceremonies, and people would go and take pictures before they could go to the front. So it's very similar in this sense to the war rage you had in the U.S., to the harsh military you had in the U.S. in the beginning of 1861, after April 1861. This guy, it's a volunteer. He's dressed as a volunteer. Volunteers were something pretty new in Brazil, because normally the army forced people into its ranks. And this guy is dressed on a different uniform, which is the uniform of a volunteer, which means he would serve out of his own will. Even women like Jovita Feitosa volunteered. She dressed like a man, and she presented herself to the conscription service, and she was sent to the front, but then she was discovered like to be a woman. And of course it was a scandal, but then she became also a celebrity for a time, because the government could use her name and say, you know, if a woman wants to fight, why wouldn't men fight too? But Jovita had a very tragic history. She became a celebrity, and as most of those women who volunteered, finally she had a very depressing life, because this meant to break ties with family and friends and to be very lonely for a long time. Even Emperor Pedro II dressed in military uniform to show that he was #1 volunteer. Oh, this is the map of the invasion. But after 1 year, the situation started deteriorating, and people were less willing to serve. And this also parallels what happened in the United States after 1862. News from the battlefields, you know, people are dying. People are not dying properly from battles, but from disease, from cholera, and from diarrhea. And less people were willing to go. So the war became pretty unpopular by 1866. And to send more people to the front became really complicated. So in some ways, it really parallels the United States, because the government had to find ways, first, because it was not so easy to defeat the enemy, although the enemy was much weaker. And then the Paraguayans circled the wagons, as they say. So it was really, they fought fiercely. And by 1866, the Brazilian government started considering sending freed slaves into the front. And this also parallels the American situation, where after 1863, United States colored troops, battalions were created to fight against the Confederacy. The difference between Brazil and the United States, it's the degree of the debate, no? Because in the US, the North had no slaves at that time, and by conscripting freed people, they were taking from the South the workers the South needed, while Brazil was still a slave society. So it was very difficult to get slaves from their owners. So a much smaller number of slaves served in the ranks of the Brazilian army than in the Union Army. And this is a big contrast. After 1863, the Union cause was also the cause of emancipation. And in the Paraguayan War, you have freed slaves serving in the army, but there is no goal of emancipation, so it's a little bit contradictory. This is another cartoon showing married men were not supposed to serve because they were exempt, because they have families, but at some point, the government started recruiting married men, so it created a big confusion. It was not popular, of course. This is the case again of freed slaves receiving the weaponry from their owners. And of course, the Paraguayan war press was very critical. This is a famous cartoon from a Paraguayan newspaper called Cabicuí, which means wasp, and showing that the Brazilian provinces as black slaves being bleeded, basically. And of course, resistance to recruitment became very strong. In this cartoon, you can see people rescuing a recruit from the jail. The recruit seems to be drunk. So you see the situation of a drunk man who was recruited in the streets, and then his friends invade the jail and save him. Well, anyway, it was a long war. After 1868, Brazilian economic resources and demographic resources started to pay off, basically because the Paraguayan population was decimated mainly by disease, by cholera and typhus. So Brazilian troops advanced into Paraguay. And by early 1869, they took the Paraguayan capital, Asunción, and technically the war would be finished, won, but Paraguayan leader Solano Lopez decided to resist in the mountains, so it became a guerrilla war. And that's another question that's still not answered, which means, why did the Paraguayans follow their leader to the bitter end? No, if the war was technically lost, why did they continue fighting? For a long time, we had an historiography vision of the war that would say, well, you know, the Paraguayans were barbarous people, they were Indians, they didn't evaluate life, and they followed fanatically their leader, which made sense under a certain perspective. But looking from another perspective, basically, Paraguay had a level of unification as a country which was unknown in Argentina. And this meant a big alliance between the Guarani descendants and the Paraguayan state. And basically, it's worth to think that these guys followed their leader into battle to the bitter end because they believed there would be no sense to continue to surrender because the way of life would end. If this was true, probably not, but they believed that. And they fought to the end. They thought they would be enslaved or something like that, which was wrong, but they believed it. And so they kept fighting. Paraguay suffered a big demographic catastrophe from a population of maybe 500,000. 60% of the adult male died, perished. So it was after the war, they had a population of something like 150,000 and few adult male, more women. So there's a long history being written now about how women rebuilt Paraguay after the war, which is a very interesting issue, by the way. But most of those who died didn't die in the combats. They died from disease and also from the evacuations, because Lopes started evacuating the population as Brazilian and Allied troops advanced. So I think, when I think about I think he was a good reader of Tolstoy, War and Peace, and he was trying to emulate the Russians, but of course, Russia was a very resourceful country. Paraguay was not, so people who evacuate, they finally died. And basically, just to finish this presentation, it has been so far so good and so long. I think that there are big differences in the outcomes of each war. First, the Union, by winning the Civil War, was able to enact progressive legislation about college grants, about land grants, about creating a unified monetary system, which propelled U.S. capitalism. Brazilian victory against Paraguay did not bring this kind of progressive results, as there was nothing to loot in Paraguay, and as this war was fought among pre-industrial societies, so there was no way to develop industrial capabilities. Basically, most of the arms had to be imported. So after the war, although Brazil won the war, it also got a big international debt by buying guns and taking loans, especially from Britain. So the fruits of the victory were bitter for Brazil too. It's why some people tells this, portraits this as the great South American tragedy. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so thank you. We do have a few minutes for some questions. We do need to be out of here by about 11:50 because we have another event coming in. But those that have questions can come to the microphone here and direct your questions to Dr. Izecksohn.
How can we turn off?
Maybe,
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question about the forced conscription of soldiers on the part of Brazil versus volunteers. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little more to both the enthusiasm for the war that led, the emperor to, where, there was kind of this enthusiasm for it, but what were, and you mentioned the one case of, the woman who, dressed as a man and the notion of the volunteer versus forced conscription. And I'm thinking primarily as a literary scholar, I'm familiar with Machado's story, Capitão de Voluntários, that great story about, people escaping to the war, the war as a place of escape.
God is big, but the wilderness is bigger,
Yeah.
they used to say.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm just wondering if you could comment a little more about that tension between forced conscription versus volunteerism.
Thank you. It's a very good question. Standing armies were never popular in Brazil, as they were not popular in the US until probably the First World War. People were afraid of them, afraid of their effects on national politics. They're afraid of the creation of the very enforced central power. So Brazil had no big army since 1830. It was very small, 16,000 people, no more than that. And the army was a place for those socially considered as socially undesirable, like vagrants, migrants, drunk people, criminals. So they would be forced into the army. Even among the poor, those considered as respected poor, like the poor who had connections or who had a farmer who protected him and to whom he was linked by personal vassalage, would not be sent into the army. So the army basically worked as a proto-prisoner system. It basically took from the small villages those individuals who were not considered desirable or good or labor. What happened is when the Paraguayan War started, for the first time, Brazil had this phenomenon of people presenting themselves to serve. But they could not go to the army hand in hand with those who were conscripts. So the government created a new status, which was the group of volunteers from the fatherland. These guys received better pay. They were rewarded with promises of land after the war, public jobs, etc., etc. So let's call it a selective incentive to enroll. So it worked well for 1 year. But after 1 year, it was impossible to create separate segments in the army. So those guys were mixed with the traditional group who used to serve. And then the recruitment became very unpopular. And as the government needed more recruits, it could not wait for volunteers to appear. So it started to impose quotas over the provinces. And in this sense, it reminds us of what happened in the American Union after the Enrollment Act was passed in March 1863, which means, the government established quotas. If those quotas are not fulfilled, it imposes a draft over the regions. Of course, in America, to do this was much more easier because President Lincoln had this amazing tool, which was the Republican Party, which empowered the government at the local level. In Brazil, there was no Republican Party to perform the enrollment. So the emperor had basically to appeal to private forces to do that, which caused a lot of unpopularity and helped some people to say that maybe the Paraguayan War may be the main cause for the overthrow of the monarchy 19 years after.
All right, we may have time for one more question. One more?
Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned that Uruguay had been a free nation since 1842 in terms of slavery. I'm wondering if there's any record of Brazilian slaves escaping to Uruguay and then fighting against Brazil, or Quilombola communities joining
Yes.
the fighting. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a very good question. There are lots of records, especially slave lists, which means Brazilian slave owners from Rio Grande do Sul. They create those lists. They said, you know, my slave ran away, he's living in that city in Uruguay. And so they sent the request to the imperial government, and the Secretary of State compiled the big lists. So we have at least 10 different lists naming slaves and where they are in Uruguay, and the Brazilian government would present it to Uruguay and say, no, you know, we want you to return these guys to Brazil. But once a slave crossed into free land, he was a free man. Not so free. He would be probably enrolled in one of the many Uruguayan warring militias. But anyway, it was very difficult to return this guy, of course, to Brazil. So we have these documents who survived, and some people worked with them, basically to try to understand patterns of escapes and what happened to the individuals who went to Uruguay. It's one of the fields that have been really improved in the last 10 years by those research. And I found recently, working at the Fred W. Smith Library, I found also slave lists presented by American patriots to the British after Lord Dunmore freed those who came to the British ranks. So the practice of making slave runaway lists is common to both countries. The problem basically is that Uruguay was very weak in military terms, so it could not support its territorial integrity. And from time to time, Brazilian militias would go into Uruguay and try to recover. And then there would be small fights. They called Californias, not like the state of California, but it's the name it had there. Finally, when Brazil presented the ultimate to Uruguay in 1865, one of the things involved, one of the elements involved was, you know, we have these lists, we have been asking you to return, you never did. So a slave who crossed the border was free, but his freedom was very weak.